Hi, you guys. So here is my chapter 9 because I think we've fallen a little bit behind. Um, but before I go through my my slides for my chapter, let me say two things. First is I'll put this slideshow without audio into a shell, the same shell as this is in, so that you guys can watch the videos. You're responsible for watching the videos in all of the presentations. The second thing I'd like to say is that I'm extremely disappointed that at last class and the quality of the majority of the presentations. I set this up again in a manner that I thought ensured that you guys would read your textbooks and in a manner commensurate with that or complementary to that, a manner that would ensure that at least you became comfortable with material from the chapters that you were assigned. And I think that I still support that conceptually because the alternative is for me to stand up for 2.5 hours, and that does absolutely no good if you haven't read your textbooks. So this model is possible because of the size of the class. So I'm going to stick with it. But I'll tell you this, if you guys show up at class next time and you start reading from the text, the chapter that you're assigned, I will make you sit down and you will fail that assignment. And it's not in my nature to abuse people or to embarrass people in front of others, but it really leaves me no other choice. Because for me, I was embarrassed just at the level of performance of some of those. So that's going to be the way it is. I would encourage you to watch this first video around behavior. Most of them are, except for the TED Talks, are fairly short. So let's go. So you learn about consumer behavior in 312 as well as the consumer behavior class. And we're concerned from a business standpoint how consumers act, what their behavior is relative, in most cases, to their purchasing habits, what influences their purchasing habits, so on and so forth. And those are generally things that find their roots in sociology and psychology around such things as attitudes and perceptions, motivation, and so on. And the same is true for management. Because people are people, whether they're working or whether they're in the marketplace purchasing, and so we're concerned largely with the same behaviors. They just manifest themselves differently in an employee context. So an organization, as a consequence, develops a behavior that's largely a factor of its culture, which in turn is largely a factor of the employees that work there, and sort of the common factors amongst those employees that rise to the surface and express themselves as far as being an organizational culture and the complementary organizational behavior. And so if you have a collection of individuals that are motivated, that have a positive perspective, you'll probably see a higher level of employee productivity, a lower level of absenteeism. If you have unhappy employees, you'll have larger turnover, which generally results in higher operating costs. You want your employees to be positively represent the company in their citizenship behavior, and because again, their behavior in the marketplace or in the community is tied back to where they work. So you want to create an environment that lends itself to a high level of job satisfaction and low misbehavior in the workplace. As a consequence, we tend to set up a system that measures these attributes of an employee parallel with their job performance. So we look to reward people who are satisfied with their job, and that's reflected in their attitude and their performance, that they can make a commitment to uh, the company, and that they engage in various dimensions within the organization. So we're concerned, as we are with consumers, we're concerned with consumers' attitudes and our understanding of those. But in the same vein, we're concerned or interested in understanding the attitudes of our employees, because we want employees that have lower rates of turnover and absenteeism. We want them to be satisfied. So one of the things that we can do is to survey our employees about their attitudes from time to time, so that we have a way to sensitize ourselves to it and measure them accordingly. And if we have this understanding, generally we can make improvements if we understand the conflicts and the genesis of what is making our employees unhappy. If we're concerned about those from an employee standpoint in a constructive way, we can make modifications to the system, to facilities, to jobs, whatever, that will foster or foment better attitudes and consequently, hopefully, better employment. I meant performance. So one of the things that we look at in the workplace that we don't necessarily zero in on at the community level or the consumer level are certain personality traits and personality theories. And of course, the reason is that we're concerned. The reason that we're concerned about them in the job setting is that we have some control over that. We don't necessarily, except at the extremes, care how people operate, let's say within the confines of their home. So you'll see that there are a couple of related videos around this topic on this particular slide that you can access from the static slides that are also included in this module. They've got some really good ones that go over and complement the reading and the text pretty well. So again, we're concerned about aspects of our employees' personality that will play out in the workplace. And the big 5 things that we generally look at are extroversion, which is the extent to which people interact with other people in a positive, proactive sort of way. Agreeableness, that do they look for consensus? Are they conscientious? Are they reasonably emotionally stable? And are they open to experience? This would relate to extent of openness to change, say, and new ideas. Now, while you can view the link from personality traits across cultures from a couple different ways. if you go back to those big five, they vary a little bit from culture to culture, but they exist from culture to culture. But when you go into a different culture, you should be sensitive to the fact where the nuances or differences occur. Uh, our culture has a high degree of individualism, whereas in Japan and other Asian countries, there's a greater sense of collectiveness or group efforts. And so, again, when you and they view different cultures view things like ethnicity themselves or race and gender very differently as well. And so you want to be sensitive to those issues and how they play out, not only in doing business in the other country, but um, as we operate in a global context, especially how the differences in culture can play out in your workplace with this extent of diversity as a consequence of in-migration to this country. And it even varies to some extent, not just with culture, but in different parts of the country. And again, we're concerned with personality uh, because it affects job person compatibility. And it also is important in giving us different perspectives on how to solve different problems. If I really liked Grant's um, example of the coyotes and his workers. And so uh, diversity in that context is often usually is actually a very constructive, positive addition to a company's operations because you get these literally different views or perceptions of the world and problem solving and getting along with people and developing new products. The fact is that there's the old adage, perception is 95% of reality. And the fact is, we see things very differently. I think that played out in this last election. It became very evident that the country is in fact divided, and that there are two very, very different ways that these two large groups see their reality. Um, and I'm not taking sides or saying it's right or wrong, but it makes the point that people, the news that they listen to, or their views on solving certain problems can be very, very different based on their perception. So, in a minute, I'll talk about the difference between attributes, perception, and beliefs. But for right now, we should be aware of what we call distorted attributions. And that relates back to what I was saying earlier, that people simply see the world differently. So, one related theory is the fundamental attribution error, that the tendency to underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of internal factors when making judgments about the behaviors of others. There's all kinds of different terms that our first cousins are related to this. Uh, Ethnocentric perspective is the, and it relates to this, is the tendency to evaluate other cultures from your own cultural perspective. Uh, and it's difficult sometimes for people to embrace the fact, again, that others simply see the world differently than they do. And in that sense, in their reality, what we're calling good or bad behavior might be just completely reversed. And then we have something that's slightly different, self-serving bias, the tendency for individuals to attribute their success to internal factors while putting the blame for failures on external factors. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, I had that idea, I just didn't do it, or uh, my neighbor screwed me over somehow, or whatever. Um, but if they have a particular talent, they give themselves all the credit in the world for that. So basically, it's taking complete and total not responsibility, credit for any of your successes and blaming any failures on other people. So if we go back to the previous slide about fundamental attribution error and self-serving bias, uh, these things play out in different ways, and they tend to lead us to shortcut our our decisions. Um, and I'm not going to go through these. I'll merely say that these things play out in different ways, and that's what this slide is about. So you can stop the slide if you'd like and read through them. But they're all important and worth a read. So just like any other people, employees will often react to what they perceive things to be. Again, going back to reality is 95% perception. Um, and the potential for perceptual distortion exists with employees just like it does with people in general, because at the end of the day, they're people. So real quickly, what's the difference between attitudes, perception, and let's throw beliefs in there too. Attitudes are things, ways that you feel about something. Like a good example would be, so an attitude might be, um, I don't like working with people that aren't the same race as me. And a perception might be, I think that they're dangerous, that they threaten us. And a belief would be, I think all people in that particular race uh, are dangerous and should be not part of our culture. And the it's really a spectrum from something that you feel to something that you're more fully and completely invested in, with attitudes being probably the easiest to manipulate, uh, or the easiest to influence, certainly from a marketing perspective, and beliefs being more ensconced, um, and perception to be sort of some way in the middle. So if you walked into a room and the lights were low and there were candles burning, your perception might be, this is very romantic, um, I like romantic. And the attitude might be, I think I'll sit down and have a glass of wine and kind of get comfortable. And a belief might be that I think drinking liquor is a sin and to be avoided at all costs. So again, it's more of a, in my mind at least, a spectrum of feelings where it's truly feelings at the left and a complete investment kind of psychologically on the belief side on the right. And it's the distinction is important because certainly again from a marketing standpoint as well as a workplace standpoint, because people have a tendency to let information in that supports what they already believe. And so, again, the more you go to the belief side, the harder it is to swing somebody off of their reality of how they see the world. So there's these three sort of levels: selective exposure. Consumers notice certain stimuli and ignore others. We all have our favorite news source that we like to watch on TV. Selective distortion. Consumers changes or distorts information that conflicts with their feeling of belief. Uh, that would be that somebody says something and you interpret it to be goes goes back to you're watching your favorite news station because you like the news and you hear something and you say yeah, that's exactly how I feel, and maybe the person is saying that on a and maybe they're not, or maybe they are saying it but not nearly as uh, aggressively or emotionally as you might feel. And then selective retention is consumer remembers only that information that supports their personal beliefs. And so that could play out in the workplace by how all of these, by how you filter information from your boss, or the information as it comes down the pipe of through whatever communication channels, as far as uh, how you process it, and ultimately how you integrate it into your perspective, your reality around the workplace. And all the time you get disparate opinions around that. No, no, he didn't say that. He said this. Or no, no, she didn't do that. She did this. So we run into these same things in the workplace that we see in the marketplace. And the reason that they're important, again, perception especially, is that depending, our perception is a catalyst to what, at the end of the day, what motivates us, and again affects our learning pattern. If we only let certain information in, then we're going to learn certain things at the expense of other things, or other ideas, or other perspectives. So, from a marketing standpoint, again, perception is important, uh, because we relate it back to attributes, price, brand names, et cetera, et cetera. But in the workplace, we relate it to issues of fairness, whether or not we're paid adequately, whether or not we're being treated fairly, and so on and so forth. So, again, perception ends up affecting motivation. And if we view that from a workplace standpoint, we can relate it back to performance. If we want people to be motivated, we want them to see things in a constructive uh, way, so that they feel like they're being treated fairly, and that they are motivated to come to work every day, to work with their uh, compatriots, and so on and so forth. All this is based on social learning theory that we learn through observation and direct experience. And so, again, in the workplace, in the consumer marketplace, we we do things to try to teach the consumer, and so that's what commercials are about. That's what samples are about, as far as direct experience. And if you turn that around and say, um, they apply to the workplace, it's the same thing. If you want your employees to respect you, then behave in a manner that is commensurate with that desired perspective. Um, Treat them well, so that they have a positive direct experience. It's easy enough to turn that back. So how do we do that? Well, we do it by positive enforcement or negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement would be good job, that's really great. Uh, Negative reinforcement would be if you don't get this done by 5 o'clock, you're fired. I think I did a little negative reinforcement at the beginning of this tape. So punishment is you get an F. Extinction is it can never, extinction is it just goes away. So this is a really good video to watch around what you think motivates people in terms of rewards and what in fact based on research does or doesn't. So I would encourage you to watch this video as well. But the fact is, well, I'll just wait and we can discuss it in class. How's that?